It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. This weekend will mark the 52nd anniversary of Richard Nixon resigning from the presidency over the Watergate scandal. We all agree Watergate was bad and a big deal, right? Well, not J.D. Vance, as he made clear recently. We've played this clip before, but today we'll take a closer look at both the real history of Watergate and why there's a movement now to minimize it. Here's the vice president speaking in June.
If Watergate happened tomorrow, it would be like a 12-hour news story. Like, the idea that it would have taken down a presidency is crazy. And by the way, if you look at the story of how the deep state took down Richard Nixon, it's not all that different from what the same groups of people, the same institutions tried to do to Donald Trump in the first Trump administration. There is a parallel.
That was at the Nixon Library, by the way, in June. The deep state took down Nixon, he says, not Nixon's crimes, Vice President J.D. Vance. So how much of that is true, and why are Vance and others on the political right bringing it up now? Let's talk Watergate history and its connection to 2026 politics with Jill Wine-Banks, legal analyst, former Watergate special prosecutor, co-host of the podcasts Sisters-in-Law and Just the Facts, and author of The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President, published in 2020. And if I have her bio right, Jill Wine-Banks was also the first woman to serve as U.S. General Counsel of the Army and the first woman executive director of the American Bar Association. Jill, nice to have you on with us again. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you, Brian. I'm really glad to be here.
I knew your Watergate background and your legal analyst podcast work and on TV, but not those other things. Did you make history in those ways?
I did. And I was lucky enough in those roles to be able to do something positive for other women. I was able to help eliminate the Women's Army Corps, which allowed women to be integrated into the regular army and therefore to be able to be generals who could head the JAD Corps or anything else in the army, as opposed to just being head of the Women's Army Corps. So it was really an exciting period of time to be part of the Pentagon at a time when the Department of Defense really did focus on defending our nation and not attacking other countries or alleged drug dealers without evidence.
Maybe we should have you back on another day for another history segment, and I'm sure you would have a lot to say about not just the things you just cited, but Defense Secretary Hegseth's, failure to promote, eagerness to dismiss women in the top ranks today. But absolutely. I saw you post that J.D. Vance is right on one point. Watergate would be a minor story today because it pales in comparison to Trumpgate, as you called it. But you wrote it was a crime deserving of removal from office. So let's break that down, beginning with the history. And let's do some Watergate 101, Jill, because so many people who didn't live through it, which is a lot of our listeners, obviously, don't know the fascinating basics. What was the actual Watergate break-in during the 1972 Nixon re-election campaign that began the saga?
So historically, there are actually two break-ins. The first one installed a listening device on the wrong phone. They intended to get the head of the Democratic National Committee, Lawrence O'Brien, but they failed. And so they went back in to do that, and they got caught red-handed. They were seen entering, they taped up a door, and the guard saw the tape on the door, called the police, and they were arrested inside. They had $100 bills stuffed in their pockets. They had expensive cameras, fancy suits, rubber gloves. And so you knew immediately that it was not just an ordinary break-in. There was something going on. And then began what became known as the cover-up. And that's really what got Richard Nixon into trouble. There's no evidence he knew that there was going to be a break-in, but as soon as he found out about it, he said, you can't let the FBI investigate the money because those $100 bills came from cashing a campaign check in Florida. And so it could have been linked immediately to the Committee to Re-elect the President, also known as CREEP, and then eventually to the White House because the people leading it were White House employees. And so the cover-up began. There was perjury committed. Hush money was paid. Oh gosh, we've heard about hush money in the Trump times as well, haven't we? And that investigation led to uncovering finally multiple tapes with Richard Nixon's voice saying, I want to be part of this conspiracy, and working with other people to cover up the original origins of the break-in. So that's what happened. And as a result of that, in an era when there was only one set of facts, when there was no social media to distort information or convey dis and misinformation, the Republicans believed the facts that they heard. And it was Republicans who went to Nixon and said, there have already been 3 articles of impeachment passed by the Senate Judiciary Committee. There will be more, and you will be convicted in the Senate on those charges because we've heard the evidence. So there was bipartisan support for impeachment, and Richard Nixon resigned rather than face impeachment. He knew a sense of shame. He also knew political reality that he was done. And so in today's world, where you have Fox News and social media broadcasting fake information, it wouldn't be a big story. No one on that side of the aisle would believe it. He would never resign. But back then, facts mattered. So that's the difference to today.
Nixon resigned during an impeachment process that, as you say, had already seen the House Judiciary Committee vote to impeach him on 3 counts. And those 3 counts were abuse of power, contempt of Congress, and obstruction of justice. Was the obstruction of justice charge considered the most serious?
I think they were all considered very serious. And I should note that the 3 charges were largely based on evidence that my team in the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office had gotten permission from the court to give the information to the House Judiciary Committee so that they didn't have to reinvent all the evidence. They didn't have to have hearings. We provided the evidence we had accumulated. We did not provide anything that said, this is the crime you should indict for, have articles of impeachment for. We just said, here's evidence we have accumulated. Here are tape recordings that you can use. And they reviewed that evidence, and they went ahead with a bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats voted for these articles. And it was the 3 top Republicans in Congress who went to the White House and said, we've seen the evidence, and we will vote to convict you. So that's how it happened. I think they were all really equally serious. The charges that we brought against his co-conspirators, we named him a co-conspirator. We did not indict him, although I believed then and believe to this day that we could have legally and constitutionally done it, and that we should have done it. That had we done that, maybe the current incumbent would not be doing the things he's doing, because he would have seen that there are actual consequences of criminal conviction. So I'm sorry we didn't do that. Leon Jaworski believed impeachment was the better process. It was a political process and was better than the criminal process. I don't think the 2 are equivalent. I think a criminal consequence for criminal actions is something that should be had, as well as a political one of impeachment.
Leon Jaworski, the lead special prosecutor at that time. Listeners, we can take your calls and texts on Watergate itself, with the anniversary of Nixon's resignation this weekend, or on the J.D. Vance clip and the movement he's part of to minimize Watergate and compare the so-called deep state, as Vance put it, of then to now. 212-433-WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. We'll get to the present eventually. I want to do a little more history with former Watergate Special Prosecutor Jill Wine-Banks. 212-433-9692. 9 too. Maybe it's worth just saying there's a cliche now that everybody would know, whether they lived through Watergate or not, that stems from Watergate, that the cover-up is worse than the crime. That's a
Yes.
Watergate reference, right? That's the origin.
And it's true because in that case, the crime was a failed burglary attempt at the Democratic National Committee. That was the underlying crime. And compared to the crimes that the Trump administration is committing, the saying of the cover up is worse than the crime, I don't think holds, because in this case, we have war crimes, we have a total abandonment of the rule of law crimes. And so I'm not sure that it's true that the cover up is worse than the crime. The other phrase was follow the money. And I think that has some relevance today, where the government is not following the money in terms of, for example, the financial wrongdoing. You have a bank that was sued, Chase Bank, sued by Donald Trump, that has said, yeah, we canceled your accounts because there was suspicious activity. We thought you were money laundering. So he brings a lawsuit that leads to accusations that would never have come public except for his having brought a lawsuit. So it was stupid to bring the lawsuit, but it's also interesting that no one is investigating those crimes. And no one's investigating the banks for not having reported the suspicious activity reports in a timely fashion against either Epstein or Donald Trump.
On the Watergate history, as a special prosecutor, you were investigating aspects of the cover-up. I believe you interviewed Nixon's White House secretary, Rosemary Woods, about the infamous 18-minute gap in a White House tape. How much, that's another thing that, as a piece almost on its own, probably survives 52
Yes.
years later, more than a lot of the other details. How much did you establish that all or part of that 18-minute gap was an attempt by Nixon to cover something up?
So the reason no one ever got indicted for that is because we can't prove exactly who did it. There's a lot of, speculation. We know that his secretary, Rosemary Woods, took the blame. She said she accidentally hit the record button instead of the stop button when she was transcribing the tapes and took a phone call. She demonstrated it in court at my request and failed. She could not do what she said and said, but it's different in the White House. So I was allowed to go to the White House and to see her demonstrate there. And the photographs of that attempt were proof that she didn't do what she said, and really were a turning point in the Watergate case. It turned the American public against Richard Nixon because they felt that it was such a lie that he could not be trusted. And I think it really did have an impact. Despite many attempts to establish who did it, we can only speculate that Richard Nixon and possibly Haldeman or his chief of staff were the two people who did the actual deletion. It was not Rosemary Woods accidentally hitting. Al Haig was the chief of staff at the time, who had, by the way, advised Nixon to destroy the tapes. And Nixon didn't destroy the tapes because he felt he was above the law. He thought he would never be held accountable. And so there was no need to do it, and that they had some economic value to him. So he didn't want to delete them. I'm sure he saw very quickly, once it was revealed that we subpoenaed them, he could not destroy them without it being an obvious obstruction of justice. Although he might have even gotten away with that, people would have felt sorry for him.
Listener writes, Republicans were behind Nixon's resignation. You just told that story about how
Yes.
several went to the White House to say, yeah, we will convict you in the Senate, including enough Republicans, so consider that. But the listener asked, with that in mind, what does Vance's claim of deep state even mean? So mean if you want to interpret that part of the J.D. Vance clip, what do you think he even meant with respect to 1974?
Well, that's such an interesting question, and I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but I guess I'm the deep state. I've been accused of a lot of things, but never that. I
But then
assume,
so was like Barry Goldwater, right? Who I think was
yes,
one of those
exactly.
senators.
Yes, Barry Goldwater, who had been the presidential candidate, was specifically asked by Nixon, supposedly in that meeting, well, I have your support, don't I? And Goldwater said, you do not. So it is the real Republicans who and Barry Goldwater was on the extreme right at the time. I don't know where he'd fall in today's world, but back then he was considered extremely conservative, but a genuine Republican. So you're right. That's a great question from your listener, and I have to give more thought to that. But yes, it was not the deep state. It was his own party. It was facts that mattered back then. And now they ignore the facts. Remember, during the impeachment of Donald Trump, the two impeachments, the Republicans had to vote not guilty. You don't vote not impeachable offense. You have to vote not guilty. And they knew the evidence. They knew he was guilty. They were just saying, well, impeachment isn't the right thing. The criminal courts will take care of it. That's what the senators said. McConnell said specifically, let the courts take care of it in the criminal process. Whereas during Watergate, we were saying, let the political arm take care of it, not the criminal one. So, very good question. Thank you, listener.
Yeah, and after January 6th, this was a big Mitch McConnell contradiction, right?
Yes.
As, you know, the head of the Republicans in the Senate, where he said, basically, let's not impeach Trump or remove him from office, convict him in the Senate, barring him from ever running for office again. Let's let the criminal justice system take care of it. But
Right.
then, of course, Republicans lobbied against the criminal justice system taking care of it, and we got the Supreme Court's immunity ruling.
Yes. Yes. That's
Peter,
something that needs
go ahead.
getting rid of.
Peter in Soho has a personal memory of the night that Nixon resigned. Peter, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello, Brian. Thank you very much for taking my call. Yes, I'll make it as briefly as possible. I was a journalist in Washington the night Nixon resigned. Actually, I was there on a related assignment. I was interviewing a profile on a young congressman from Maine, Bill Cohen,
Yes.
who later became senator and then was Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton. Anyway, I had finished for the day with Cohen. I was back at my hotel, and I flipped on the news, and there was an announcement on the news that the president was going to resign. And at that moment, my phone rang. My editor in New York said, "Okay, there's going to be a demonstration for sure. Go down to Lafayette Park and do a man on the street." So I got together and I went down there, and there was a crowd of a few thousand people and milling about with signs, and at some point erupted jail to the chief, jail to the chief. And cars, at that point, you may recall that Pennsylvania Avenue was not closed off to traffic, and cars were going back and forth. And the drivers of the cars caught on as the beat to jail to the chief and would honk, 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 in synchrony with the jail to the chief, jail to the chief. And I went around interviewing various people, man on the street kind of things, and there were a lot of people who had their young children with them. And so I asked them, why did you bring your children? And invariably, without exception, they all said, Mom or Dad said, I wanted to teach my children that democracy works. And
Yes.
this is how it works. And the president has resigned because the people have come up, the system works and democracy works. And it was a rather moving experience. So that's my story.
That's a great oral history, Peter. Thank you very much for sharing it. And well told, as we might suspect it would be from someone who was a journalist at the time. Were you thinking anything in particular listening to Peter's call, Jill?
Yes, I was, because I think one of the reasons I wrote my book was because I wanted to capture a moment in time when justice prevailed and democracy worked. And it's interesting when you reflect back then, if you look at the poll numbers for Nixon, and remember, he won 49 states. He had a landslide when he was reelected after the break-in. The trial was about to start before the election. The election was in November. The trial ended in January, so it was about to start right after the election. And despite that, and despite what I thought was pretty clear by that point, that the White House was involved in the break-in, he won a landslide. So he was extremely popular. And then as evidence came out from our team, as we investigated and things leaked, and as the Senate had public hearings and John Dean testified and then Butterfield revealed there were tapes, all of these things were going on, and you could see the direct correlation, information coming out. The poll numbers started to sink until he got to the point that Trump is now at, right before he resigned, because the facts mattered back then. So yes, it's really true that democracy worked, justice prevailed, there was full accountability criminally and politically. And we don't have that in our country anymore. I think November may be some accountability for this president. I'm hoping for a landslide for Democrats where, although they won't be able to pass legislation because Donald Trump will still be president and can veto legislation, they can at least not fund his war and other things. They can possibly enforce funding of SNAP benefits. They can possibly prevent firing people at will without cause. So there would be some good consequences of stopping Donald Trump from doing his worst things. And even, we talked about the Army, getting rid of Hegseth would be worth it. Just to, if they could impeach him, I'm sure that there are grounds for impeaching Hegseth.
Well, you obviously have objections to all kinds of Trump policies. There is a debate in the Democratic Party, and Democratic congressional candidates have been asked this during primary debates. I guess it'll come up in the fall election campaigns in swing districts. Do you think it's worth going through another impeachment of Donald Trump, or at least impeachment investigation and that whole process, and then trying to bring it to a vote on the House floor, as opposed to just focusing on maybe all these other policies that you just cited? Do you have an opinion about that as a former Watergate prosecutor?
Well, yes, I do as a citizen, I would say. I think there are so many important policy things to address that the Democrats should get busy on that, unless they have a supermajority and could actually end up with a conviction. In the current state of affairs, there wouldn't be enough votes for conviction. I don't know why the Republicans have stayed with someone who is clearly criminal, who has enriched himself by billions of dollars at the expense of us. If people start to see how much it's costing them, not just in terms of going to the grocery store and being shocked at your final bill, going to a restaurant and seeing things that used to be $10 are now $19. It's time to see the reality of it. But I don't know that we'll have enough votes to actually convict. So if there isn't enough votes to convict, it's not enough. The facts are already out there. There's no reason to have a hearing or an impeachment just to get the facts out, because they're already out. We know. We're watching boats being blown up and no drugs have been recovered. If there were drugs on those boats, they would have recovered some. If there were drugs on those boats, they wouldn't have sent back the survivors that they picked up. There were survivors after one of the first killings, and they shot them, which there was a huge outcry because that's a clear war crime. So the second time there were survivors, they actually did not kill them. They picked them up, as they are supposed to do. And they didn't bring them back here to try them. because there was no evidence. So they sent them back to their home countries. That's proof to me, beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's no evidence that there is any justification for these attacks on boats in international waters.
As a former General Counsel of the United States Army, have you contacted or thought of contacting the person who's in that position today and raising what you were just describing?
I hadn't until you mentioned it, but maybe I would. But we know that he has fired anyone who will say anything to him, either Hegseth or to Trump. Both of them fire people who speak out. He has eliminated not just women and people of color from any consideration for promotion, but he has fired JAG officers. He has dispatched JAG officers who should be doing their job in advising the commanding generals of wherever they were reporting to do immigration work for which they are not qualified, or to U.S. attorneys' offices, again, focusing on immigration work. And so that the work of JAG, is the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the lawyers for the military, are not getting done. But I don't have any hope that anyone would do that. I have joined in all the letters that former Department of Justice lawyers have sent, urging the non-confirmation of Todd Blanche, for one, and many other issues that have come up that involve the Department of Justice. I have joined every single one of those letters and will continue to do that. But, I'm going to try to get some of the former general consuls of the military and see if we couldn't write a letter saying that. It's a great idea. Thank you, Brian.
I wasn't suggesting it. I was just asking if you had done it.
But it's a great idea.
But when we continue in a minute, folks, we'll make an even more explicit segue to the present movement to minimize Watergate under Trump by playing a clip of Democratic Senator Walter Mondale from the Watergate era, and then talking more about it with Jill Wine-Banks and you. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue to take a closer look both at the real history of Watergate with the 52nd anniversary of Richard Nixon's resignation from the presidency this weekend, and why there's a movement now to minimize Watergate, including Vice President Vance saying it would not result in removal from office today and blaming deep state actors similar to those aligned against Donald Trump today. We played that clip at the beginning of the segment, but it's been a half hour and I know the audience turns over. So for those of you who haven't heard it, here's again about 25 seconds of J.D. Vance speaking at the Nixon Library in California at the end of June.
If Watergate happened tomorrow, it would be like a 12-hour news story. Like, the idea that it would have taken down a presidency is crazy. And by the way, if you look at the story of how the deep state took down Richard Nixon, it's not all that different from what the same groups of people, the same institutions tried to do to Donald Trump in the first Trump administration. There is a parallel.
And he got applause. And again, our guest is former Watergate Special Prosecutor Jill Wine-Banks, co-host of the podcasts Sisters-in-Law and Just the Facts, and author of the book The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President, published in 2020, besides having been the first woman General Counsel of the United States Army and first woman Executive Director of the American Bar Association. So after Watergate, there were a number of reforms passed by Congress intended to address the kinds of underlying issues that many identified as contributing to the Watergate scandal. It would have been easier to say, of course, a break-in is bad and wrong. Of course, a cover-up of a break-in is bad and wrong. But it was actually seen as deeper than that. So here's a clip of Democratic Senator Walter Mondale of Minnesota at the time on one of those issues.
There's been a trend toward what I call the imperial presidency. And, of course, we've seen it in its exaggerated form under Mr. Nixon. And if we can, before this is over, establish the principle that any president, including this one, is under the law and must respond to the Constitution and the courts and to the Congress and the American people, we will have saved ourselves from a very dangerous trend.
So, Jill, why executive power and not just the break-in and cover-up?
Because that is ultimately where the crime came from. It comes from the top, and it was an accretion of power that Richard Nixon started, which again pales in comparison to how Donald Trump has treated the presidency. And so many good laws were passed to prevent future mishaps or crimes. I mean, even things like that are being challenged now, the Presidential Records Act, a simple thing where your records belong to the public. They aren't your personal property. Finance reform for campaigns. And that was important because without the excessive money that Richard Nixon had, I don't think the committee to reelect the president would have considered spending money on the break-in. If you could just picture this, Gordon Liddy goes to the office of the Attorney General, John Mitchell, who would soon take over as head of CREEP, but who was still the Attorney General at the time, puts up an easel with some charts showing Operation Gemstone, which included the Watergate break-in and other ridiculous activities by what became known as the White House plumbers, who were originally created to stop leaks, which is why they were called the plumbers. And the only thing that John Mitchell said was not, that's completely illegal what you're proposing. Those are crimes. Get out of here. He said, you're asking for too much money. Cut the budget and it'll be okay. So Gordon Liddy cut the budget and got the okay from John Mitchell and went ahead with these ridiculously illegal activities. So, and at that time, people could contribute cash to the election. And they did not have to have any reporting of who was giving money. So they had in White House safes tons of cash. When Richard Nixon asked, how much will it cost us to pay off the burglars to keep quiet? And someone said $1 million. He said, oh, I know where we can get that money. He didn't say, oh, we can't spend $1 million, because they had cash overflowing in safes in the White House. So campaign finance reform happened. And then the Supreme Court said, oh, in Citizens United, no, corporations are citizens and they can make unlimited contributions. So we were starting to lead to an uncontrolled imperial presidency. And it's so interesting that Mondale saw this. I don't know how old that clip was, but based on his voice, and I knew him quite well during the presidency because he was vice president in the term that I served as general counsel of the Army under the Carter administration. But he and I did a program at the University of Minnesota talking about Watergate for a law class there. And I got to know him very well. So his voice sounds a lot younger there. And he was prescient in seeing what was happening. And, part of the imperial presidency of Richard Nixon was he tried to have gold festooned helmets put on White House guards to look fancier, which sort of is really interesting now that we see the gold emblazoned all over the White House that Donald Trump is doing. He failed. I mean, people laughed at it and it never happened. But you have 24 karat gold being applied to statues in Washington when people are starving. What a waste of money. And besides, it's gross and gaudy.
Yeah, that Mondale clip comes, I might say, from our archives, because that was Mondale on NPR in 1974 in January.
Yes.
So that was
Wow.
before Nixon actually resigned.
Yes.
But complaining about the imperial presidency. And you just touched on the other underlying Watergate issue that I think sometimes gets lost, that it wasn't just the break-in and the cover-up. So the imperial presidency was one, and the other one was corruption. And we know all the ways that Trump has been accused of corruption in his presidency. What was the corruption aspect of Watergate?
Well, what the corruption was the abuse of power. It was Richard Nixon saying to his top aides, tell the CIA to stop the FBI from following the money. Tell them there's national security involved, knowing, of course, there was no national security involved, that the issue was it would lead to proof that Creep had paid, the committee to reelect the president, had paid for the break-in, that the burglars' $100 bills came from a campaign check. So it was that kind of abuse of power. It was paying hush money out of campaign money to keep the burglars from saying who had hired them. It was telling people, you can always say, I don't remember, even if you do, which is, of course, perjury. If you say, I don't remember when you really do remember, that's perjury. And so they were suborning perjury. So there were all these elements. And then there was also doing favors for corporations who were giving them money. And there were campaign finance violations. Watergate is mainly seen as the cover-up case. But within our office, there was my team, which was the cover-up case. But there were campaign finance people who were looking at campaign finance crimes. There were Watergate dirty tricks, I don't know that rises to the level of corruption of the system in the same way that using the Department of Justice or the FBI or the CIA does. But nonetheless, it was using campaign financing to do kinds of dirty tricks that were harmful to Democrats. That was the whole purpose of it. And again, the corruption was not at all like the corruption we see now, where it's out in the open, taking an airplane from Qatar and keeping it for himself and letting us pay to outfit it so that it meets his specifications in terms of aesthetics, but also now having it recalled because it isn't safe enough for him to actually use right now. And if he was leaving it for the next president, well, maybe that would be one thing. But he's not. He's taking it with him. So I can't think of a more clear-cut example of corruption. The abuse of the Department of Justice under Todd Blanche, the deal
and,
to
and
give
just to
him,
say about Qatar, where it becomes potentially corruption is that they want things from the United States.
Of
and
course.
they're giving the president this huge personal gift. Actually, listeners, and Jill, if you're interested in hanging around as a listener, in our next segment, we're going to be touching on how Trump's crypto business, the
Yes.
Trump family crypto business, and its relationship with the United Arab Emirates might be contributing to being soft on the UAE's role in enabling the genocide, as many people call it, in Sudan. So that piece of corruption is going to come up more specifically in our next segment. But in our remaining minutes, we have so many people calling in with memories of the day or the moment or the week when Nixon resigned. Let's just get a little bit more of this oral history out here from some of our listeners, because some people have some great stories. Gail in Oceanside, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello. Yes. Oh, I had been traveling in Europe after finishing going to college with my then future husband, and we had ended up in Paris, and we noticed on the day we were going to come home that there were local newspapers that all said, "Le fromage est seul." The cheese stands alone, with a picture of Nixon. And that was in Paris. And we got on the plane, and it was an overnight flight, and we got home, and by the next day, he was not president anymore. And that's what I always remember about how things ended. The fromage est seul.
The cheese stands alone. Gail, thank you for that memory from being in Paris. Amy in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Amy.
Hi. I'm remembering a song, and I've been trying to look up who what group sang it, but the beginning of it is, if I had a friend like Miss Rosemary Woods, how simple my life would be. I'd give all my problems to Rosemary Woods, and she would erase them for me.
Wonderful, Amy. Thank you very much. I did not think we were going to get singing on the Watergate segment today.
I want a copy of that song. I love that.
Do you? We'll look it up. But do you know who the artist was? It's so related to your work, investigating the Rosemary Woods
no, I haven't.
tape erasure.
I haven't heard it. And
right.
To the other caller, I would say we referred to Nixon as the big cheese. So it's really funny that was the headline in France.
All right, one more. Laura in the Bronx. You're on WNYC. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I lived through this, and I remember being in a doctor's office undergoing a procedure where everybody in the room was dead silent, listening to the investigation. And the quote that has lived in my memory ever since is Senator Sam Ervin saying, in questioning Ehrlichman, one of the plumbers group, one of the instigators of it, that he said, because I can understand the English language, it is my mother tongue, and his beautiful drawl, and it made me so proud. It made me so proud. And I think that's one of the few moments when I've been proud to be an American, that they weren't these senators were standing up for what was really an American value. And it matters to me so much now, in retrospect, because we've lost that in the GOP senators not standing up for what is right for the country. They're disgusting. So anyway, but if you would talk more about that exchange, I would really love it, because I know that this was the investigation of the plumbers group. If you have any more information about that, I'd love to hear it.
Laura, thank you. By the way, the song, If I Had a Friend Like Rosemary Woods, was apparently sung by Bill Horwitz. Apparently it's still available on Spotify for listening. Can you answer Laura's question, and then we're out of time, Jill?
Oh, gosh, it would take forever. I can't speak to that specific question and answer, but the plumbers team, again, is a very good example of the corruption. They were using these people, paying them out of the White House and out of the campaign to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. Ellsberg was the one who revealed the Pentagon Papers and the lies that were being told to the American public about the war in Vietnam. And so they went in and broke into they were the same group that broke into the Democratic National Committee. And they allegedly, or at least a reporter was asking the White House whether they broke into my house, because there was a break into my house during the Watergate investigation. And it was a suspicious break-in because very little was taken. So they asked whether the plumbers had broken into my house as well. There's so much rich history in the Watergate and so much relevant to today. But because of dis and misinformation and the total control of Donald Trump over the Republican Party, things are just going along as if it was normal. When he violates the Constitution, the Emoluments Clause says he can't take a gift like that, and yet no one is doing anything about it. Congress has abandoned its role. And so one of your other callers mentioned how disgusting it is where we are, and that's part of the reason, is that Congress is not acting. The Republicans have totally caved to him. And if they vote to confirm Blanche after saying they wouldn't, shame on them. He is not qualified to be the Attorney General.
Let me extend you by one more question then and ask why you think it is. Because it's not just Trump's control over the Republican Party and the Republicans in Congress, as if he has the power to be a dictator like that individually. Somebody who's more supportive. I'm just looking for this text because it's been a while since it came in. But somebody basically wrote, you have to remember that Trump was elected in 2024. It's democracy. And I take that one step further to say the grassroots of the Republican Party, as exemplified by, all these primaries, supporting people who support Trump and look the other way at all the things you've been raising, a lot of Americans feel this way and are willing to look the other way. How do you think we got to that point, this point in our country compared to 52 years ago?
I'm going to say I was lucky enough to get tickets to see the Obama Center. And the reason I mention this is because the whole focus of that is on what we can do and accomplish as a democracy. Every exhibit ends with, imagine your impact. And we've come a long way from that. It's inspiring to be there, but it's also depressing because I couldn't help but think about what you're saying, which is how did we get to where we are? And part of it is and misinformation. It is partly because of Fox News and other cable networks. It's partly because of social media. And it's partly because, for some reason, Donald Trump has had a very good winning record in terms of making people lose elections by not supporting them or supporting their opponent. And so people are afraid of losing their own power. But what's the point of having that power if you won't stand up for what's true and what's right? When will facts matter again? And I can't help but think that even the most MAGA people will start to see they can't afford to buy a gallon of milk. They can't afford to drive to work because of the cost of gasoline, because he has started a ridiculous war where we are worse off now than we were. So I'm Pollyanna, I have to say, Brian. I really believe that we will come out of this November with a Democratic House and Senate, maybe not enough to avoid a filibuster, but we will have some accountability going forward, and that we will get to a point where we can undo the damage that has been done, even if it's just ripping out all the gold from the Oval Office. But I would like to see that money spent on helping Americans and getting health care, getting education improved again. Those are things that we need to be doing.
Pollyanna, a.k.a. Jill Wine-Banks, legal analyst, former Watergate special prosecutor, co-host of the podcasts Sisters-in-Law and Just the Facts, author of the book The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President, published in 2020, and also the first woman to serve as U.S. General Counsel of the Army and first woman executive director of the American Bar Association. Thanks for joining us today, Jill.
Thank you, Brian. Have a wonderful day.